Hi, folks. Welcome back. Um, we are entering into week 6. Oh my God, I cannot believe that we're entering into week 6, but nevertheless, that's where we're at. Week 6 takes us away from the first part of the book, where we're, kind of looking at the overall approach to gender, and we're going to start focusing on particular institutions over the next couple of chapters. This particular chapter and this particular section is going to be looking at the gendered family. So let's get started. So, as many of you all know, we are all part of families, and needless to say, families are confusing. Not only are families confusing in your individual lives, but Americans themselves are confused about the family. On the one hand, it seems as if the family is fragile. Of course, we can look at the divorce rates. But on the other hand, the family has proved to be a really resilient institution. Although the family has changed in form over time, the family still continues to exist. And we have to remember that the family is not just the idea of the nuclear family, mom, dad, 2 kids. The family has changed over the past few years. We know, as I said, that divorce is increasing. Marriage is decreasing, but marriage still remains popular. We also know that cohabitation is becoming a favored choice over marriage. I think the numbers that that cohabitation has increased over the 20th century is from about 1 million to 8 million families are based on cohabitation ideas versus actual marriages. We also know that teen pregnancy and motherhood is as high as it's ever been. So divorce rates are going up, marriage rates seem to be going down, and teen pregnancy seems to be on the rise. These are some really challenging aspects to stable families over time. But we also know that the family is adapted to many economic, social, cultural changes, the dispersal of the extended family over geographic space, the entrance of mothers into the workforce, changing definitions of the family to include LGBT people. So as these challenges have run across the family over time, we see the family adapt. And although the family has changed, families do still exist, and families are still important. And if we're going to truly understand where we are in the 21st century, we're going to have to move past that 1950s ideal nuclear family idea that has governed what is quote unquote normal in our society. We're going to have to start looking to some other forms, because as we dig into the nuclear family, we find out that it's not as normal as it's been sold to us as. In order to understand the family where we are today, we of course need to do a history look. So as always, if we're going to understand where the family is as we view it today, we really have to look back in time. I've encouraged all of you to embrace history. If you are to understand where you are today, whether that's in reference to the idea of family or the idea of gender or the idea of race, you really need to understand where we've come from. And the family is no different. It's changed over time. It's went from a more liberal approach to equality within the family to a more conservative approach to equality in the family. to a movement back to maybe a little bit more equality in the family. So it's not static. It is adaptive, it is reflexive, and it is ever changing. So one of the big things that's happened in the American family is how it's changed in reference to the economy itself. Historically, before the Industrial Revolution, before the development of capitalism really took hold, most of the work was done within the household. And so when most of the work was done within the household, we saw a much more egalitarian approach to governing the household. Yes, there were chores that women might have done more than men, but they were not mutually exclusive. The idea that men went to work out in the secondary economy and women stayed home and took care of the domestic needs of the home had not taken shape yet. But once capitalism starts to really develop in the United States, the men are pulled out of the home. The public sphere becomes the men's sphere. The private sphere, women are kept within the home, and the private sphere, i.e., the home, is where women are trapped in many respects. Another thing about the traditional American family is that it was, as I mentioned, it was much more egalitarian. American women were encouraged to marry for affection, not for dowries. This is very different from the realities of European women and many other women across the world. So if you're marrying for affection, then you have a little bit more control over who you marry and why you marry. And that, of course, changes in or morphs into something different in the mid 20th century. Beginning of the 19th century, changes take shape in reference to the American family. As I mentioned, paid work shifts work from the home and the mill to the factory, shop, and office. Men are being sucked away from the private sphere and placed into the public sphere. Of course, at the same time, house cleaning, child rearing, and other domestic duties are left to women. And with the rapid industrialization of the 20th century, these new ideas related to the family start to really take shape. And once they start to solidify themselves into the social culture, they just become seen as being natural. As this happens, the importance of fatherhood declines as men are taken away from the private sphere of the home. They have less of a role to play in child rearing, and at this particular time, as you can imagine, divorce rates climb. So as men play a less significant role, women start to feel a little bit chafed about this, and divorce rates go through the roof. Racism and the fear of race suicide, of course, has led to a massive infusion of public expenditures to get families back to where they were. With this, a new family form emerged triumphant, the nuclear family of the 1950s. So as we begin to unpack racism and the fear of diversity, the fear of the interaction with the others as African Americans and other cultures that have been subordinate to the white culture start to gain ground in the United States, a new form, a form specifically directed at protecting the dominant white culture, takes shape. And that's the nuclear family. Um, let's see here. So why was the nuclear family so popular? Well, it was characterized by high rates of marriage, especially within white families, high fertility rates, which increased um, the number of white children being born in the United States. It structured the marriage relationship in a way that created stability and lowered divorce rates, partly because of those being shunned for thinking about engaging in divorce. This just was not what those engaging in the nuclear family were supposed to do. Of course, the husband is the breadwinner in this form, and the mother is a housewife, and she is subservient and in deference to the father. The father controls the purse strings, and as we know, in any capitalist economy, the person that controls the money controls everything. This, of course, was legitimated by the structural functionalists in the discipline of sociology. So social science sees and constructs the nuclear family as being a functional aspect to society, which gives it merit and legitimacy and a normalcy that people should strive for. This idea of the nuclear family and its characteristics, of course, lead to the development of suburbia and the baby boom under a veneer of domestic bliss, though was an increasing restlessness of both men and women. The family was now the sole source of happiness and relief, a job previously accomplished by community networks, civic participation, and extended kinship ties. So the family itself, as it becomes more nuclear, as it becomes smaller, it breaks down the traditional community binds that have essentially strengthened us over time. It wasn't necessarily the family where we found our strength and where we engaged in our joy. It was the community itself, and the nuclear family breaks that up. And when it does that, it really creates this social angst that it's no surprise that by the mid-1960s, the pressures on the nuclear family really start to bubble over. People cannot continue to pretend they are the ideal family without consequences. And many of the many of the children that are socialized in the nuclear family are the ones that rebel in the mid-1960s, driving much of the social change and feeding many of the social movements of the time. Just to give you a brief idea of how these folks were feeling, as men were taken away from the home, they began to feel isolated from their families and their children. The connections that they were making with the family that were once strong had been weakened because of this new familial form. So the form itself is breaking down the connections between the mother, the father, and the children. Women as well felt like home was a comfortable concentration camp. They were trapped in the home. They couldn't escape. These largely middle-class white women, afforded the luxury to not work in the first place, all of a sudden felt imprisoned, trapped in their own homes, trapped in this social form that had somehow made them subservient to men, and especially the men that they're married to.